They sent him an ugly bride to mock the scarred rancher. He answered by opening his door. By sundown, the cruelest insult in the valley had become the only thing he'd die to protect. The silence in Adam's ranch house was a settled thing, as old and worn as the leather of his saddle. He moved through the main room, a space built for purpose, not comfort. The bed was a simple frame with a mattress for one, the blanket folded with military precision. A low lamp on a crate-turned table held just enough oil for the evening, its light a small, lonely pool in the vast darkness of the prairie night. His scarred face, a road map of a life he never spoke of, was etched by the flickering flame. The left side, from temple to jaw, was a landscape of taut, burnished skin that pulled the corner of his eye and mouth into a permanent, grim cast. He had bought this land, this isolation, with the inheritance of that pain. Here, no one stared. The cattle didn't flinch, and the wind didn't whisper rumors. His world was one of hard work and solitude, a fortress built of routine. He ate his supper of stew and hardtack, standing by the open doorway, the heat of the long day still radiating from the parched earth. The chirp of crickets was the only sound, a stark counterpoint to the profound quiet he had cultivated. He owned everything he could see, and he shared it with no one. After cleaning his plate, he latched the heavy plank door. The solid thud of the bar sliding home was the only reply to the vast emptiness outside, a final period on another day lived alone. He did not know that the world as cruelty was about to deliver an insult to his door, an offering intended to mock his solitude that would, instead, irrevocably end it. The debt was a matter of honor, a concept Jed Barlow held in contempt. Barlow, a man whose wealth had grown by preying on the misfortunes of others, owed Adam a significant sum, the price of 100 head of prime cattle. He arrived at Adam's ranch not with coin, but with a cruel, smirking proposition. Beside him, in a wagon, sat a young woman. She was still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I've come to settle our account, Adam," Barlow announced, his voice carrying an oily satisfaction. "I'm a man of my word." He gestured to the woman in the wagon. "My ward, Evangeline. Her dowry will clear my debt to you. She's of marrying age." The insult was as sharp and brutal as a shard of glass. Adam knew of the woman. She was spoken of in town in hushed, pitying tones, defined not by her character, but by the large, deep purple birthmark that covered the right side of her face, a stark map of misfortune from her hairline to her chin. They called her Barlow's ugly bride, a burden he was eager to offload. To offer her to Adam, the scarred recluse, was a public sneer, a calculated act of malice meant to pair one monster with another. Adam looked from Barlow's predatory grin to the woman in the wagon. Evangeline finally turned her head, her eyes meeting his. In their depths, he saw not shame or fear, but a profound, weary resilience. She was a survivor. He knew it instantly. She held herself with a quiet dignity that defied the humiliation of her circumstance. He saw a soul as barricaded as his own. He could refuse, could send Barlow packing and demand his money. But as he looked at Evangeline, he saw the lonely life that awaited her, a pawn in the cruel games of a man like Barlow. Leaving her to that fate felt like a violence he could not abide. He thought of his own lonely house, of the silence that was beginning to feel less like peace and more like a cage. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The debt is settled," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Barlow's smirk widened, triumphant. He had his prize. But as Evangeline stepped down from the wagon, her worn bag in her hand, and walked with a steady, proud gait toward the ranch house, Adam knew it was not Barlow who had won. He had accepted an insult, and in doing so, had just taken possession of the only thing of value on the entire dusty plain. The first days were a careful, silent orbit. Adam gave Evangeline the single bedroom, a small, private space with a door that latched from the inside, and he took a bedroll in the main room. He was a man of routine, and he did not alter it, but now it included small, unspoken considerations. He began leaving a second cup on the dry sink in the morning. He ensured the water bucket was always full. In return, she moved through his space with a quiet respect that bordered on reverence. She did not rearrange his things or fill the silence with chatter. She observed, learned, and slowly began to contribute. He would come in from the fields to find his mending pile gone, the shirts and trousers later appearing on his bed, the seams repaired with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She had a way with the animals, a gentle touch that soothed the skittish new foal and coaxed the barn cats from the rafters. One evening he was repairing a bridle, his large, calloused fingers fumbling with a small, stubborn buckle. He heard her approach, and she placed a small tin of tallow on the bench beside him, a silent offering. He grunted his thanks, and the waxed leather slid into place with ease. Their fingers brushed as he set the tin down, a fleeting contact that was over before it began, but the warmth of it lingered. He began to learn her rhythms. He noticed she would often stand at the window in the evenings, looking west, her expression unreadable. He saw that she saved the crumbs from her bread for the small birds that nested in the eaves of the barn. He learned the sound of her quiet, humming breath when she was concentrating on a task. These were the small, intimate details of a person's existence, details he had not been privy to in years. One afternoon she was returning from the small creek, her arms laden with wild herbs. She stumbled on a loose rock, and the bundle scattered. He was there in an instant, kneeling to help her gather the delicate stems and leaves. He picked up a fallen wooden trowel, and without thinking, held it out to her, handle first. She took it, her gaze meeting his for a long, silent moment. It was a small gesture of trust, a habit of a man used to handling tools and weapons, an unconscious signal that he meant no harm. In that moment, the space between them, once filled with wary distance, was now charged with a fragile, burgeoning trust. The summer heat settled in, thick and heavy, pressing down on the dry land. The longing in Adam's heart grew in the oppressive stillness, a quiet, persistent ache. He found his gaze drawn to Evangeline constantly, the line of her neck as she bent over her herb garden, the focused intensity in her eyes as she read one of his few books by lamplight, the surprising strength in her hands as she kneaded dough. He had built his life on the premise of needing no one, and the realization that he was beginning to need her quiet presence was a deeply unsettling tremor in the foundation of his world. He started finding reasons to be in the house more, mending gear that wasn't broken, sharpening knives that were already keen. The silence he had once cherished now felt hollow when she was not in the room. One afternoon, while securing a loose fence post, the hammer slipped, striking his hand with a sickening crunch. Pain, white-hot and immediate, shot up his arm. He cursed, cradling his hand, seeing the skin already swelling, the knuckles broken. He went back to the house, intending to wrap it in a rag and ignore it, his usual method for dealing with injury. Evangeline was at the table, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. She looked up, and her eyes immediately fixed on his injured hand. "Let me see," she said. It was not a request, but a gentle command, spoken with a quiet authority that took him by surprise. He hesitated. To show weakness, to accept help, was not in his nature. But the genuine concern in her eyes disarmed him. He slowly, reluctantly, held out his hand. She took it in hers, her touch incredibly gentle. Her fingers, stained with the green of her herbs, were cool against his hot, swollen skin. "It's broken," she stated softly. She guided him to a chair, and then moved with a quiet efficiency, fetching a basin of cool water, clean cloths, and a small jar of a pungent-smelling salve. She cleaned the wound, her movements deft and sure. She made a poultice and bound his hand with strips of clean linen, her touch firm but careful. He sat in stunned silence, watching her. Her face, in concentration, was beautiful. The birthmark was simply a part of the landscape of her, the deep purple a stark contrast to the paleness of her other cheek. He realized, with a jolt, that he no longer saw it as a mark of imperfection. He simply saw her. When she was finished, she looked up, her face close to his. "You must be careful with it," she whispered. The air between them was thick, charged with an intimacy more potent than any kiss. It was a chosen moment of closeness, a surrender of his stoic independence, a quiet acceptance of her care. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rough. She simply nodded, her eyes holding his for a beat too long before she moved away. He sat there for a long time, the cool throb of his hand a distant sensation compared to the frantic, unfamiliar beating of his own heart. Jed Barlow was not a man to let an insult go unanswered, and in his mind, Adam's acceptance of Evangeline was an act of defiance. He had meant to saddle the scarred rancher with an ugly burden. Instead, whispers from town suggested the girl was thriving. Barlow began his campaign of social pressure subtly. He told the story in the saloon, painting Adam as a monster who had claimed a damaged bride, implying she was a prisoner on the isolated ranch. The narrative was cruel and effective. It culminated in the arrival of the town sheriff, a man named Gable, at Adam's doorstep. He was a decent man, but one easily swayed by public opinion. "Adam," Gable said, shifting his weight uncomfortably on the porch, "there's talk in town, concerns about the girl. They say you're keeping her here against her will." Adam's jaw tightened, the scar on his face pulling his mouth into a deeper scowl. He didn't answer. He just stepped aside, revealing Evangeline standing in the doorway behind him, a basket of mending in her hands. She had heard every word. Sheriff Gable's face flushed with embarrassment as he looked at her. "Ma'am," he stammered, removing his hat, "I apologize for the intrusion, but are you here by your own choice?" Evangeline looked not at the sheriff, but at Adam. She saw the rigid control in his posture, the cold fury in his eyes, a fury on her behalf. She then turned her calm, steady gaze to the sheriff. "I am the wife of a good man," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is my home. I am exactly where I choose to be." The simple dignity and conviction in her words left no room for argument. The sheriff, thoroughly chastened, just nodded. "My apologies for disturbing you," he said, backing off the porch. He rode away, leaving a thick silence in his wake. Adam turned to Evangeline. The word she had used wife hung in the air between them. It was the second time it had been spoken, first by him to a predator, now by her to the law. He had an overwhelming urge to reach for her, to touch her, to thank her, but his bandaged hand and his own ingrained reticence held him back. Instead, he just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a gratitude and a dawning devotion so profound it made her heart ache. Their bond, forged in the quiet of the ranch, had just been tested by the outside world, and had proven itself to be as strong as steel. The trip to town was a necessity they could no longer avoid. Supplies were low, and Adam needed to speak with the blacksmith about a new plowshare. The tension was a palpable thing as they rode in the wagon, the memory of the sheriff's visit still fresh between them. They were a unit now, a fact that would be on public display. As they walked down the dusty main street, a hush fell over the onlookers. People stopped and stared, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were the town's curiosities, the monster and his ugly bride. Adam felt the old familiar anger rise in him, but then he felt a small pressure on his arm. Evangeline had linked her arm through his, a simple public act of solidarity. Her head was held high, her gaze fixed forward, a queen surveying her lessers. Her courage was a balm to his fury. The confrontation happened outside the general store. Jed Barlow, drunk and belligerent, blocked their path. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he sneered, his eyes sweeping over them with contempt. The happy couple. A matched set of broken things. He gestured to Adam's face. "Tell me, Adam, do you put a bag over her head at night? Or do you just turn the lights out and appreciate the symmetry?" The crowd that had gathered gasped. The cruelty was breathtaking. Adam froze, his body coiling like a snake ready to strike. But before the violence could erupt, Evangeline squeezed his arm, a silent plea. He looked down at her, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but an unshakable faith in him. He took a deep breath, the rage receding, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He looked directly at Barlow, his voice low but carrying to every person on the street. "This is my wife," he said, his gaze unwavering. He then turned his eyes to Evangeline, his expression softening into something no one in the town had ever seen from him. "And she is the most beautiful thing in this valley." He placed his good hand over hers on his arm, a public gesture of ownership, of devotion, of profound tenderness. Evangeline, her heart soaring, met Barlow's stunned, furious gaze. "I am where I belong," she said, her voice ringing with the truth of it. They stood together, a united front, turning the public humiliation into a powerful declaration of their bond. Without another word, Adam guided Evangeline around the speechless Barlow and into the store, leaving the crowd to whisper not about their flaws, but about the unshakable strength they had just witnessed. They had chosen each other, openly and clearly, in the face of the world's ugliest judgment. The ride back to the ranch was a quiet one, but the silence was different. It was not the wary, uncertain silence of their first days, nor the comfortable silence of their established routine. It was a silence humming with the aftermath of their public stand, with the weight of the words that had been spoken. When they arrived home, the setting sun was bathing the ranch in a soft golden light. The ugliness of the town felt a world away. Inside the house, the familiar quiet enveloped them. Evangeline began to put away the supplies, her movements precise, almost brittle. Adam watched her, seeing the slight tremor in her hands, the tension in her shoulders. The courage she had shown in town had taken its toll. He walked over to her, his heart aching with a tenderness that was almost painful. He stood before her for a moment. Then slowly, hesitantly, he raised his good hand. She stopped what she was doing, her breath catching as she watched him. He gently, so gently, touched his fingers to her cheek, to the birthmark that Barlow had so cruelly mocked. His touch was not one of pity or curiosity. It was a touch of reverence. He traced the edge of the mark, his calloused fingertips a stark contrast to the softness of her skin. "He's blind," Adam whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. A single tear escaped from Evangeline's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb, his gaze holding hers. It was an act of aftercare, a quiet cleansing of the day's wounds. The tension in her shoulders finally released, and she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. He had not defended her with his fists, but with his words, and now with his touch. He had not tried to hide her or ignore the part of her the world deemed flawed. He had touched it with reverence and declared it beautiful. In that moment, the last of the walls around her heart crumbled. He was her protector, not from the world, but within it. He was her shelter, her champion. He drew his hand back, and the space between them vibrated with all the things they had not yet said. The battle was over, and in the quiet of their home, all that remained was the profound, healing tenderness that flowed between them. That night, the house was filled with a new kind of intimacy, born from the day's shared trial. The lamps were lit, casting a warm, gentle glow over the room. Adam sat at the table, his bandaged hand resting on the wood. Evangeline sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The silence stretched, but it was a silence of anticipation, of a dam about to break. "I came here to be alone," Adam said, his voice a low rumble, his eyes fixed on the worn grain of the table. The world has a long memory for a man's mistakes. For his face, he finally looked up, his gaze raw and vulnerable. I thought solitude was the only peace I would ever know. Evangeline's heart ached for the lonely man he had been. I know what it is to be looked at, but not seen, she said softly. To be defined by a single part of you, as if the rest of your soul does not exist. He nodded, a shared understanding passing between them that was more profound than any embrace. When Barlow made his offer, Adam continued, his voice thick. It was meant as an insult. To us both. But when I looked at you in that wagon, I didn't see what he wanted me to see. I saw strength. I saw a kindred spirit. He took a breath, the confession costing him dearly. This arrangement was forced upon you. My choice to accept it was to protect you from him. But now, my choice is for myself. I am asking you to stay, Evangeline, not as payment for a debt, but as my wife, by your own free will. He had laid his scarred, lonely heart bare for her. She felt the truth of his words settle deep within her. He was offering her not just a home, but a place to belong. He was offering her a choice, the one thing that had been stolen from her. I am already home, Adam, she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her love for this quiet, gentle man. He stood up, walked around the table, and gently pulled her to her feet. He took her hand, his good one, and held it. The invitation was clear in his eyes, a silent question. And with a trust that was now absolute, she stepped into his arms for the first time. He held her carefully, his embrace a circle of warmth and protection, and in the quiet, lamplit room, their two lonely souls finally, truly, came home. Their shared confession was a turning point, a quiet vow that settled into the foundation of their lives. The awkward distance was gone, replaced by an easy, domestic intimacy. He would watch her, a small, private smile touching his lips, as she carefully tended the new splint on his healing hand. She would find he had left a small, intricately carved wooden flower on her pillow, a silent testament from a man whose hands were more eloquent than his words. Their love was a quiet language, spoken in 1,000 small gestures. One morning, Evangeline noticed the shawl she wore in the evenings was becoming frayed, the wool thin and worn. She thought nothing of it, but Adam had noticed. The next week, he rode to a neighboring ranch, a place known for its prize-winning sheep, and traded a young prime bull, cornerstone of his own herd's future, for a basket of the finest, softest merino wool yarn, the color of a summer twilight. He didn't present it to her with a flourish. He simply left the basket on the chair by the hearth, where he knew she would find it. When she discovered it, her fingers sinking into the incredible softness, she understood the magnitude of the gesture. A bowl was a fortune, a promise of future wealth. He had traded a piece of his future to ensure her warmth and comfort. It was a gift of profound devotion, a promise spoken in the language of a rancher. She found him in the barn, currying his horse, his shoulders slumped with the fatigue of the long ride. She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his strong back. He froze for a second, startled by the unaccustomed gesture, then relaxed into her embrace, his body leaning back into hers. "It's just wool," he mumbled, embarrassed by the depth of her unstated gratitude. "It's everything," she whispered into his shirt. "Thank you." He turned in her arms, his gaze soft, his scarred face illuminated by a shaft of dusty sunlight from the barn door. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the edge of her birthmark. There was no more shame, no more hiding. There was only the quiet, unshakable truth of their love, a love built not on grand declarations, but on small, sacred acts of service and devotion. The seasons turned, and the ranch, once a bastion of solitude, came alive. The silence was now punctuated by the soft murmur of their voices, the sound of two people sharing a life. A gentle warmth, A hint of humor began to seep into their days. It appeared in small, unexpected moments. A lanky calf, full of foolish courage, attempting to headbutt Adam's formidable bull and being sent tumbling in the dust, an event that drew a rare, shared laugh from both of them. Evangeline's attempt to teach Adam how to properly knead bread, which resulted in his large hands getting hopelessly stuck in the dough, leaving her to gently and laughingly pry him free. These were the small domestic beats that wove the fabric of their partnership. The house for one became a home for two. He built a new set of shelves for her growing collection of herbs and books. She planted a tenacious climbing rose that began to crawl up the weathered wood of the porch, its bright, defiant blooms a splash of color against the muted landscape. They were a team, in the fields and in the house. He learned to read her moods as easily as he read the sky for signs of rain. He knew the slight furrow in her brow meant she was worried about a sick animal, and the small, contented sigh she gave in the evenings meant she was at peace. She, in turn, learned the language of his silences. She knew the rigid set of his jaw meant he was in pain, and the quiet way he watched her from across the room was his version of a love poem. Their bond was no longer a fragile thing, but a deep-rooted certainty, as solid and enduring as the land itself. They had been two outcasts, judged and discarded by the world. But together they had created their own world, a sanctuary built on mutual respect, quiet tenderness, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The insult that was meant to break them had instead become their greatest blessing. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek bed in brilliant strokes of gold. The air grew crisp, and the days shortened. The work of preparing for winter was hard, but it was a shared labor, a provisioning for their future. They moved in a comfortable, practiced rhythm, mending the roof, stocking the larder, stacking firewood. They were building a life together, one log, one preserved jar at a time. One evening, they stood on the porch, watching the sunset, a fiery spectacle of orange and purple. The day's work was done. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the colors fade, the first stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. The ranch house behind them was warm, a single lamp glowing in the window. "I was thinking," Adam said, his voice a low rumble beside her, "of adding another room, on to the east side. Come spring." Evangeline turned to look at him, her heart giving a small, hopeful leap. "A new room?" "It's a small house," he said, stating the obvious. He wouldn't look at her, keeping his gaze on the darkening horizon. "A new room would give us more space for whatever comes next." It was the closest he could come to speaking of a family, of children, of a future that extended beyond the two of them. It was a vow spoken in the plain, practical language of a builder, a rancher. It was a promise not of forever, but of a tangible, shared tomorrow. A foundation to be laid, walls to be raised, a roof to be built. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers lacing with his strong, calloused ones. "I think," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "that a new room would be a wonderful idea." He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she could see the hope and the love shining in his eyes. He squeezed her hand, a silent confirmation of their shared dream. It was not a grand proposal under a moonlit sky, but something far more real, far more profound. It was a quiet promise made on a dusty porch, a vow to build a future together. The first chill of winter had settled over the land, and the world outside the ranch house had grown quiet and still. Inside, however, a steady, gentle warmth radiated from the hearth, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The small house, once a symbol of Adam's isolation, was now a sanctuary of shared intimacy. Every object held a story of their life together. The two mismatched mugs that sat side by side on the dry sink, the worn book on the table that they were reading aloud to each other in the evenings, the soft twilight-colored shawl draped over the back of Evangeline's chair. Their love was in the very air of the place, a quiet, settled devotion that needed no declaration. The scars and marks that the world had used to define them had faded into insignificance, seen only as part of the beloved landscape of each other's faces. One night, a cold wind moaned around the corners of the house. They sat before the fire, Adam cleaning a piece of harness, his hands slow and methodical, and Evangeline mending a tear in his coat, her stitches small and neat. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the whisper of the wind. Adam paused in his work, watching her, his expression soft in the firelight. He had thought his life was complete in its solitude, that he had all he needed. He had been so wrong. She was the missing piece he never knew his soul was searching for. He put down his work and reached out, his hand covering hers. She stopped her sewing and looked up, a questioning smile on her lips. "I am a man of few words, Evangeline," he began, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I may not say it as often as I should, but my life began the day you stepped out of that wagon." She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "My life began," she answered softly, "the day you looked at me and didn't see a monster." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, his scarred cheek brushing against her skin. It was a pledge, a prayer, a lifetime of love conveyed in a single reverent gesture. They were not an insult. They were not broken. They were two halves of a whole, made perfect in the eyes of each other. The rancher had been offered an ugly bride, and in her he had found his angel, his partner, his home.